voices united, no one's too small. Alex and I can cry out loudly for truth, scream for justice like a fever broken youth. Every word's a bullet tearing through the night. In this war of words, the soldiers in the fight.
And we're live. This is Sitrep PH, the podcast on Philippine affairs and Filipino interests. I'm Ivan at home from Manila with my co-host Inform PH. The Alice
Hi,
Guo
Ivan.
story heated up this week as Wang Fegui, a Chinese with supposed ties to Chinese tycoon Zhang, has personally confirmed to the office of Senator Luis Ontiveros that dismissed Banban Tarlac Mayor Alice Guo is indeed a spy based on documents provided by him by Xie himself.
Okay, so Guo's real name is alleged to be Guo Huaping, the same name as a Chinese national whom the National Bureau of Investigation says has the same fingerprints as the dismissed mayor. So Wang was first interviewed in Al Jazeera documentary where Zhang, claimed that Guo is a spy for China's Ministry of State Security, like he is. So the Senator Antovero's office tried to get in touch with Xie, but was not given access to him, prompting them to reach out to Wang, a former cellmate of Xie in Thailand, and who was imprisoned for a year and a half due to a credit card fraud case. Ivan?
And naturally, with all these talks of spycraft, the CCP, and their attempts at influencing foreign governments, we have with us the one and only China insider himself, David Zhang. David runs the famous China Insider YouTube channel, which covers US-China relations, China's societal issues, and the Communist Party politics. He's also a frequent contributor at the Epoch Times in the United States, and whose publications publishes and exposes what has recently been featured in Senator Ontiveros's inquiries here in the Philippines. So, David, welcome to Sitrep PH.
Thank you. And I actually just want to make a correction. I'm not contributing for the Epoch Times. I'm very independent. So I think that's why I'm allowed to basically have a lot of freedom in terms of what I can cover. And that's also why I was very shocked and wanted to follow closely on the case of Alice Guo. But yeah, great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much,
David, for that information. Before we start, we usually allow our guests a few minutes to introduce themselves, how they got started in their line of work, and their motivation for it. So, David, what got you started in probing into the dark underbelly of China and the CCP?
Yeah, so I was born in China, but I immigrated when I was quite young, and but throughout my youth and growing up, even into college, I was always consistently watching what was going on in China, because it is a part of, I think, it's a global issue for one, but it's also one that's obviously very dear to me because I had grown up there. But seeing the way that the government had devolved into this form that it took really saddened me, and I always felt like there was a need for to revive the destruction that was caused by the Chinese Communist Party. So it was always felt like, to me, was something that I cared about a lot. The thing that really stuck to me, I guess what kept me on this topic, was the COVID situation in China. Initially, actually, I remember very vividly in 2020, this was January or February of 2020, I was still teaching in a classroom because I graduated and I got a teaching job. I was actually still joking about how the COVID thing is like, oh, everybody, you got to start using hand sanitizers now, you got to wear a mask. I wasn't aware how severe it had been, because then we honestly had no idea what was happening in Wuhan, in China, until March, April, where everything kind of exploded. So by then, I felt like I was, like everybody, this information void. But then once I started to look more and more into what was happening in China, what they were doing to the people, how essentially caused this global pandemic to shut the world down. I'm sure you guys in the Philippines also have a lot a lot of experience. with what happened back then, the whole vaccine diplomacy, you call it diplomacy, was a threat to the world, just a lot of things, right? So in October of 2020, I decided to join NTD, which is a news channel based in New York, for about a year or so. And so then in 2022, I decided to go independent, to focus on China as a YouTuber. So that's how I got started in this iteration of my journey with China. So when I first started with China, I just simply wanted to tell the side of China that I knew growing up, what I knew from the people around me about the government, the party, the culture, and everything around it. And there you see so much pro-China, honestly not even pro-China, like pro-Communist Party message being spread by English-speaking channels, by state media from China, and how unfair it was to watch the world get poisoned by this. So I think it was kind of, I thought it was my duty to start something that could counter that. So that's kind of like my intent when I started the channel. I didn't really think it was gonna, grow so fast within a year. So to my surprise, I guess a lot of people now, given the fact that COVID, I think, changed a lot of people's perception on China. So the care for what's going on in mainland China is great right now, and so I think that's where my journey is taking me now. Going forward, I think I'll just be continuing to do what I think is necessary and important, topics that matter to people around the world, particularly because I'm in the U.S. So what matters to people here as well.
And speaking about your Chinese origins and the Wu Maos that are online, that, like you said, you've been accused, a man of Chinese origins, you've been accused by pro-Beijing voices online as being a xenophobe and a propagandist and a biased man with an anti-Beijing line. And so before we start the interview proper, I guess it's time to clear the air, David. Why do you hate China so much? And why are you a racist?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I love the fact that they blend this idea that criticisms for a government, criticisms for a ruling party is somehow xenophobic, racist, xenophobic, whatnot, right? Those terms. I think it's intentional. Obviously, I don't hate China. I don't hate the people of China. I think you can ask people who are supposed to be in conflict with China, right? They don't hate the people of China. It is, in fact, the government that has attempted to use the people to use the shields so that they can do whatever they want. The ruthless behaviors that we see with the bullying of the Philippines is one of those where you say, oh yeah, look at those Chinese people doing that. Well, those people are ones who were, ordered to do so, or they are brainwashed to do so, which I think is actually the sad part. So, this question is so important you asked me, and I think it's very important for people to understand that when we say China is bad, it is not describing that the vast majority of the people, but rather it is because of the environment that's been shaped by the Communist Party that's forcing people to adopt certain ways. And that's, I think, a really important thing to note, which is that China before the CCP came is a vastly different world than China after the CCP, especially after the Cultural Revolution. So yeah, I unfortunately, I do hate China, but I don't hate the people, and I love the culture. Yeah, I have a lot of beef with the government.
And it is exactly that insight of yours and the way you are actively monitoring the scenes, the what's going on the ground in China. That's the reason why we brought you on, because you were one of the first non-Filipino news outlets that covered the Alice Guo scandal here when it broke out here in Manila. And you've been covering it for several months. And so our first question would be, several months in, and with Guo now under the custody of the Philippine Senate and Security Services, what are your impressions so far with how things are going? And what else do you expect to be discovered moving forward? Are we just hitting the tip of the iceberg over here in your mind? And do you expect further revelations to break out? How do these things usually go in other countries?
Right. So Alice Guo is a very typical case. Now, the way I see it now is that Alice Guo is you can see her sort of identity as on a spectrum of how deep the infiltration of the CCP really is around the world. The reason I say that is because here in New York, actually, you hear a lot about the recent cases of these Chinese spies, or at least people working for the Chinese government, being arrested on charges, accepting bribes from the government, etc. And they are very deep in the government's positions now by the time they were found. Whereas Alice Guo, she was relatively still small in terms of her political role, but before she was discovered that, what was happening in the compound that she was allowing to manifest, to fester in Banban. So my initial impression when I saw the news about Alice Guo, I wasn't actually considering that she could be such a big threat, not because I didn't know that she would be one, but because I thought it was so common, because China has these type of people everywhere around the world. In every single country, they have people in the grassroots level to influence, right? Whether it's politicians or trying to become politicians themselves. So when viewers started to comment, because I have a lot of Filipino viewers, when they started saying, you got to cover Alice Guo, I was like, okay, fine. I ran out of topic for this week. Let me go look into it. And then something very interesting that I found immediately was a case that I had covered prior to this, which was in Myanmar or Burma, of this northern Burma criminal, it's a little town in northern Burma, very close to China, that it's basically run by Chinese families, and they do all sorts of bad stuff there, right? They do gambling, scams, prostitutions, all these things, drug trafficking. And I thought that what if there was a network of Chinese people running this type of stuff across Southeast Asia? And then I look at Alice Guo, what her, Pogo compound was doing was exactly that. And I thought, oh, this must be like a case where she's trying to run into a political office to serve as the front of this entire operation. And then I read more into it. I find out what they were doing was also including human trafficking. That really immediately raised an alarm in my head, because anytime you mention China and human trafficking, you're looking at, especially one that is, I looked into her family background, how there's associations to the Chinese embassy, the historical ties in the province that she was from, where she basically, they're very friendly with the Chinese government. I see that she could possibly be also working towards surveilling other Chinese nationals or even dissidents on the run from China in the Philippines. So that immediately raises it from a so-called, criminal activity to a national security threat, for me at least. But at that point, I still wasn't sure if Alice Guo herself was one that's like a properly trained spy, so to speak. Because in the US, right, there's a lot of cases where, especially female, they are professionally trained by the Ministry of State Security, and they have intentions such as approaching, politicians, right, using the looks and everything else to extract information. And we had very infamous cases of this happening, and you also had cases where politicians would get invited to China, and they get their photos taken, and they get blackmailed, extorted, etc. Right? So Alice Guo didn't really fit, for me at least, first, this category of professionally trained spy. But it did fit to me what was essentially the United Front operation for Chinese abroad. What that basically means is China has this department and a strategy they've long used called United Front operations. They've used this even during the Second World War to rally against the Japanese. The idea is that because we have a common enemy, let's work together to build a relationship that can benefit our common sort of goal, right? So what they do is, let's say in the Philippines, they have this Chinese family, or they have this association of the Chinese people from a local area, right? They usually have these across the world, especially in Chinatown. They say that, let me approach you, let me give you some, we'll fund your next events, or you can get some sort of a benefit from the embassy nearby, the consulate. In turn, you can provide us, let's say, help us if like our enemy comes to visit, you got to protest, you have to, talk with your politicians, tell them to not vote on certain things that wouldn't be beneficial. And then they co-opt these organizations. And this happens around the world. So I thought that the case of Alice Guo was one where her tied associations are captivated by China, and she's working on their behalf, right? Last point is that there's also possibility of her already being involved in money laundering, because there's her lavish lifestyle, which I thought was very interesting for a pig farmer, or to have that, right? Helicopters and cars and all those things, jewelry, bags, etc. I was like, she must be doing money laundering already, because when you do that, and when you're Chinese, a Chinese national in the southeast part of Asia, you want a shield. You want insurance that you won't be held criminally accountable in that country, right? People, the Chinese nationals in Cambodia, in Burma, they all have Chinese Communist Party support in order for them to continue what they do in those countries without meeting the local law enforcement trouble. So I was thinking maybe Alice Guo wants to seek protection in the Philippines as well. So those were some of my initial thinking. Now, obviously now I actually think that because we know that she's been working, or at least she has files from the Ministry of State Security because of Shen Zhijiang, who has a dossier on her, then it makes me believe that she has been working with the Ministry of Security for a very long time. And then you also mentioned a part about where we should watch going forward. I think the big point, at least I say in my video, is whether or not Alice Guo will tell it all about who she's working with. Because if she does,
Right.
there's possibility of not redemption, but at least we understand the threat of the CCP. So that's I don't think she will do it though, but I think there's a possibility of that, because we saw it in Xinjiang doing it. So that's what I'm watching going forward to see things how.
Why don't she think she'll do it the same way that Xi Jinping did? Why don't she think she'll cooperate as much with Philippine authorities?
So in my latest video, or maybe a video before that, I mentioned how her family is in Fujian. It's in a very coastal town called Jinjiang, which is actually, if you look on the Google map, it's very close to Kinmen, which belongs to Taiwan. But her family has a very historical background. If you look at Chinese documents, the family, it's a big family, right? So there's not just her immediate family, but the Guo clan, so to speak, is very spanned out. They're very known in the Fujian area. So they've done a lot of stuff with the government already. There is a level of threat that I would imagine the Chinese government would place on her family. If you tell us, the Filipino authorities, that is, if you tell us, then we could possibly do things to your family. I think for many people, I've seen so many cases over the years where they use the family ties, they use the relationships to scare you, to coerce you into saying you do certain things or you don't see your family again. Or maybe you got cousins back home that want a job. Well, don't tell stuff to the Filipinos. We ensure things like that. So they have a level of threat there. I don't think Alice Guo will do that out of the fear that something could happen to her family.
You mentioned about She Zhejiang, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right, and revelations by Al Jazeera, because it became a really big story here, and it really opened up, or rather kicked up a hornet's nest with regards to the Alice Guo story. How significant are these new revelations, and how credible are they? How can we say She is indeed a Chinese asset and not merely a petty Chinese criminal saying what he needs to say to
right? So that's a very interesting question. Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question, and it came across my mind as well. The only way you can really tell if somebody, there's no 100% way to prove that he is who he says he is. But the problem is, and occasionally there's two ways I can look at this. The first one is within China, there's different powers at play. Some of them want to see the demise of certain parts of the government, right? So, for example, there's infighting between Xi Jinping, his faction, and other powers. So sometimes they will do these things where they will actually send people out, who once worked for the Ministry of State Security or whatnot, to reveal it all, or at least reveal something that would be very negative to this party, right? It's political infighting. Another part of this is that what Shi Zhejiang said, and what I've been able to look into, at least on the facts part, matches that of my own research and my own understanding of the situation. So yes, there's no 100% way to prove that Shi Zhejiang is telling the truth. But from the evidence that we've seen being presented by him, it looks to be exactly what my own investigation found out, which, the area of where they are, I think they even sent the journalist from Al Jazeera to go take photos that showed, the Guo family residence. They also showed like the local community communist office, etc. So I think at least now you also mentioned this. I have to tell people, right? A lot of times these guys that are outside that are telling us the truth, they're not telling us 100% of the truth. They're telling us maybe like 80 to 90% of the truth, not because they're trying to lie, but because there are certain things that if they do tell, that's sort of like revealing it all, right? They don't want to not have a backup in case something happens. So I think Shi Zhejiang is another motivation, I think, for why he came out to do this is that he was abandoned. There's a very famous anti-CCP influencer in the US. He's now in jail. His name is Miles Guo. Same last name as Alice Guo, actually, but obviously different. He also used to work in the spy part of the CCP. The reason why he decided to go against them now is because they abandoned him. So when you get abandoned by this, Shi Zhejiang was also essentially abandoned by the Ministry of State Security. There's really no other way other than to tell it, because you're not going to go back to China, so why not just tell it? So I think there's also that motivation as well.
And what about Alice Guo, sir? There's a debate currently here in the Philippines on whether or not she's just a petty criminal or some sort of trained Chinese asset. Especially if you view her in the Senate hearings, it appears to even our political commentators here that this is a woman with skills in how to manipulate individuals, how to hold herself up under pressure, the way she's charming even a lot of the male senators. So is this a skilled member of the Chinese triad, or is this an asset that they picked up who used to be a member of the triad or something? Or is this a real plant by the Ministry of State Security?
Right. I personally, I have not found enough evidence to suggest that she is a trained, proper agent of the Ministry of State Security. What I've been able to conclude from covering this so far is that she has some level of communications with the Ministry of Security, at least by the time that she started doing the money laundering stuff. So my original thought for this was that Alice Guo is somebody who may have been, so I'm reading some stories. The reason why their family moved to the Philippines is because their business in China didn't go well. So I don't doubt, okay, I'm not saying it's 100% true, but I don't doubt that they initially came to the Philippines to find a better life than they did back in China. But somehow during the process of them being here for a few years, they started to get involved in the illegal stuff. And like I said, once you get into the illegal stuff, you need protections. It comes from two sides. One is the Ministry of State Security, and you have to do spy stuff for them. Or the other side is, a big power within the CCP that can provide you protection. From the looks of it, they found it within the Ministry of Security. And so that's why when I mentioned the Pogo compound had human trafficking or surveillance involved, that's when the things escalated to the national security level. So what I think is, ultimately, to give you an answer, Alice Guo is a front of a criminal activity organization, because she's also tied into the one that was the money laundering case in Southeast Asia. She's also tied to Shi Zhejiang, is that she was introduced to similar criminals who are also working across Southeast Asia, but the overarching sort of control and command apparatus is under the Ministry of State Security. So is she a spy proper? Right now, I think not, at least from the evidence I can see, but she is definitely providing intelligence and otherwise information to the Ministry of State Security, much like what the other spies in the US would do. But she, I guess, was found out before she's able to, move up the political ladder and start reaching some very critical information. But just to one point to add to this, for the CCP, they don't care if intel is cheap or low quality. They want intel from anything, right? They want every level of intel from every level of society. So for them, they do have different levels of approaches to how they gather intelligence, who they send to do what. So there's different levels to that as well. So I think like Alice Guo does serve that purpose of what capacity she was doing, and it was beneficial for the Ministry of State Security. I'm sure there's also some levels of training she was doing with them, and it wouldn't doubt that she was, from the looks of it, she had a really weird like reaction when during one of the House hearing recently, that when they showed the family photos, the House residence, she seemed to get more angry, not herself, which was interesting for me. So that's why I also felt like, this seems to, whenever you tie into her family, she gets very nervous. I think it's because they know that her family is, like I said, it could be being hostage or used as a threat, like a bargaining chip to tell her to, not say anything, or I don't know. But it seems like the family connection back in mainland China is very important for her. And so it made her break character.
David, you mentioned in your work that CCP infiltration and psyops aren't this big James Bond style capers, but are in reality more insidious, with them getting as much, if not more, from penetrating local and cultural institutions than national governments. Can you expound on this? Because that the Alice Guo story isn't really the only example. And we saw this case in New York governor's office having a similar scandal with their, I believe she was a diversity officer, Linda Sun. Can you tell us about this story?
Yeah, so there's actually two in New York. There's a very close assistant to the mayor of New York City, Winnie Greco. She was she's now under investigation. There's also another one with the government of New York, so the of New York, and the former governor of New York as well. So for the state level, the city level, there were two cases involving. Both cases were with Chinese spies. And with Alice Guo, you can kind of see that she was still a small town mayor at this point before she was caught. And the reason why you see the CCP doing this is because they understand a lot of things come from the grassroots level. Even in the US elections, a lot of different things are, like even in the votings, right? Who wins, who loses in certain parts of the world, the country, is determined by a few hundred or a few thousand votes. So in those cases, they insert somebody in that area who has influence. They can sway that, right? They can try to change the policies. In the US, you also have local areas where they're buying up a lot of land near these military bases in the United States, or they're putting up cellular towers next to the military base. That's a Chinese brand like Huawei or something. A lot of these have to be done on the grassroots level, on the local level. So it doesn't matter how small the political office may be. It doesn't matter how big they are. It's much easier to change something when you're not, the headline of news every day. If you're a U.S. senator or a U.S., congressman, you're on the news constantly, right? It's hard for you to, if you're a spy, that is, it's hard for you to do what you need to do for the government of China. But when you're, just small town mayor, or when you're like a personal assistant, it's very easy to change things, right? Like the stuff that the agent for the governor was doing was like they were blocking the delegation of Taiwan from meeting with the state of New York. She was forging signatures. She was facilitating meetings with Chinese officials. All these things, like you don't hear those on the news at all, but those are done and they actually matter a lot. So I think for the Philippines as well, it's very good that I'm actually so happy how fast like the Philippines realized what threat China was to the country. And whether that's the bullying with the Coast Guards or this case with Alice Guo, I hope that no more like this will happen in the future, because it's like I want to tell people very clearly, this is not a discrimination of Chinese people in the Philippines, right? This is not saying that every Chinese person in the Philippines is a spy or criminal, but this is like you have one bad apple, and that's gonna put a lot of problems onto the rest of the people. Like we should see the dynamic differently. It's not the racism or the xenophobia of the Filipino government. It's the fact that we have a criminal spy or whatever she is doing it and that's tainting the reputation for everybody else. And I think that's a part where we need to understand, right? I don't think anybody, at least I don't think, wakes up in the morning and just say, I'm going to be mean to Chinese people today. That's not how things work. So I do appreciate the Filipino government for being so alert. I think it's necessary, right? Just much like how the Japanese government is very alert about the threat as well. When you're that close, and when you've been, enduring the misery for so long, I think it's easier for people to understand. Oh wow, yeah, this is exactly what we're going through. So yeah, big props for them. And just I guess the last point about the whole like grassroots dynamic is that the CCP cares about long-term relationships for these spies. Like they can be infiltrating for 10 years before they make anything come to realize their efforts. So they have a lot of time to spend on that, right? They're not looking for like a quick 2-year thing. So yeah, like you mentioned, it's not James Bond. It's not going and blowing things up, but it's very dangerous because think about the things that they can do. They can protest your policies. They can even participate in your local elections. They can vote in town halls. They can, spend money to support whoever they think is pro-China. All these things are done out of the spotlight. So that I think that's where I'll end for this.
And it's a good thing you were mentioning that about how they can actively try to influence local politics and culture, because certainly here in the Philippines, we've got the National Security Council here and the armed forces warning about Chinese influencers or Chinese-backed influencers that are attempting to subvert Philippine morale, especially with the West Philippine Sea that you hinted onto. I want to bounce off on that question, on that line of questioning. You mentioned earlier the United Front. Perhaps you can explain to our listeners what the United Front is and what is the overall goal for these CCP-backed institutions around the world. Do you see a recurrent pattern in cases such as like Linda Sun, Alice Guo, and others around the world? What's the overall objective here?
So the United Front is actually different than the spying of the Ministry of State Security. So all these different organizations, they work hand in hand. They don't. They're not necessarily built off of one another, but they do work together in a sense that the common goal is to defeat the other country without really firing a shot. So I'll use the example of Taiwan because I think Taiwan is a little bit similar in the case of the Philippines. The reason is, so in Taiwan, right, for a very long time, I guess until about 12 years ago, there was a very warm welcomingness to China because they used economic incentives to get people in Taiwan to go to China for business, etc. And so what they've done is they've cultivated these people in China, in Taiwan, to say that if a war breaks out, we're inevitably going to lose. So why not just avoid a war and reunify? The second thinking is China is not our enemy. It is trying to bring about a better life for us, and we should work with them. And then the third thinking is that rather than seeing them as the enemy, maybe we should think about cooperation. So the United Front idea is that let's not pretend like we don't have problems, but for the meantime, we should cooperate with each other because we have a bigger thing to worry about. So what United Front really does is, for example, in say the U.S., you have this Chinese Association of Overseas, professionals, right? The CCP United Front group will go and approach this group, whether through direct contact or the local embassy, and tell them, say that we're going to fund your next, New Year's gala or mid-autumn festival performances or whatever the case may be. And in turn, what you can do is send your guys to come over and attend our annual meeting for overseas Chinese. When they go back to China, they get invited to all these lavish events. They get tour of Beijing. They get a tour of the government buildings, etc. And these people, a lot of times, they also have a very they have a very big wish to be part of China. Because a lot, especially if you're a Chinese person, you've been living overseas for a very long time, you feel like you're discriminated against or whatnot. And now, the Chinese government comes out and say, yeah, you can be loyal to the government, right? So they give them a lot of incentives, they give them a lot of money, and they say that, okay, we need you when, say, President of Taiwan comes to visit New York, you're going to bring a bunch of people, you're going to go protest, and you're going to say, we don't welcome them there. And because the person that they approached is American, because they're American citizen or whatever, they enjoy all of those rights, freedom of speech, all those things, freedom to protest in the US, so they can do those things, right? So basically, by captivating these small organizations across the world, you slowly have hundreds of thousands of associations that do the exact same thing. All you have to do is invite them to China once a year to give them a little celebration. Maybe you get to meet Xi Jinping, shake his hands, So by the time those relationships are cultivated, you develop this network of people who, and then I'll bring it back to the Philippines in a second, but whenever there's a national security event or a US-China relationship event, or in the case of Taiwan, these people come out and they start yelling things like, China's not bad, China's not our enemy. Why is the US government doing this? Why is the Taiwanese government doing this? We shouldn't be thinking this way. Okay, so they can activate these. They're like almost like sleeper agents in a sense. Now, with the Philippines, what's interesting is that I can't speak, you guys probably know this more than I do, but I can't speak I'll speak on a more, which is that I find the awareness of the threat is much higher in the Philippines than even in Taiwan. I don't know if it's because the threat of China is more concrete in recent years because they've been bullying the Philippines in different ways or not. But I find that it's so interesting that it doesn't seem like the United Front work as well in the Philippines than other countries. So I don't know. I don't know if you guys feel the same way. But
Perhaps
to me,
to come to that, it's the idea that if your current warships are constantly bullied and suddenly you find random Filipinos stating that, oh, we should be friends with China, we should be doing this and that, it seems like not only empty words, but more like suspicious words. Because why would you engage in such rhetoric when our fishermen and our naval forces are getting harassed?
Exactly. And I think that's the difference between Taiwan and the Philippines right now, because Taiwan technically, it's much better now. I'm not saying they haven't improved on that awareness aspect, but it used to be like the CCP hid their intentions, right? They say that, well, with the Philippines too, with any other country, they used to hide their intentions. They say that, oh yeah, we're not trying to start a war. We're not trying to do anything. We just simply want, what's ours. We'll give you a lot of money, a lot of incentives. And you mentioned that, it also reminds me to tell, which is the reason why this sort of relationship has been breaking down with different countries, is because China doesn't have enough money anymore to sustain their economic drive, to silence different countries. So that's why you see a lot of countries are kind of shifting their view on China, is because when China doesn't have the money to silence you, they no longer have as much control over you. But yeah, I think that's where I see. So another point about the United Front is also that you don't necessarily have to be like how do I put this? You don't have to be so pro-China, right? Sometimes they even involve organizations which are essentially like there's a group in the US, it's called something Pink, Project Pink or something like that. But basically they're all about, this like whole feminism, anti-war, like pro-Palestine.
Wait, Code Pink is linked.
Code Pink, yeah.
They're linked to the CCP, bro.
Yep. Yeah. So those organizations, like on the front, like they're not run by Chinese people, but they're still getting, the same thing from the Chinese government. They're linked to the CCP, like you mentioned. But yes, it doesn't always have to be Chinese people too. It can be like you mentioned, it could be a Filipino person, it could be a Taiwanese person, Japanese, whoever. So that makes it so difficult, because you're essentially saying your own country's men, you're supposed to say that those are spies, or those are, Chinese influencers. Like, that's what makes it so hard. And that's how they use that in the Second World, or I guess after World War II, against the Nationalist Party, the KMT, right? The CCP always was never the one that was fighting the Japanese. They were the ones who were hiding in the mountainside, the countryside, to, grow their forces. But in the early days, they used United Front to turn a bunch of Nationalist Party members into communists by just working this little, infiltrating their group, telling them that you gotta come work for us. Like all these are done by the United Front work to co-opt those organizations and to turn them into communist ones. And so it's very difficult to deal with. It's in fact more difficult to deal with warships and missiles because you can't see them most of the time.
David, you said there could be potentially be thousands of Alice Guo around the world. So you mentioned, of course, we have a high awareness of these kinds of threats. Like, how worried should other governments be with this sort of threat? Like having their own version of Linda Sun or Alice Guo in their midst.
Yeah, it's tough. I'll give you an example. When the only reason that the US started to look into this whole Chinese infiltration is honestly because after 2016, after Trump came into office, the whether you like him or not, his China policy at the time fundamentally changed, and even Biden adopted many of it, right? And I don't see this changing for the near future. It takes a lot of Canada is also another great example because, after they arrested the CFO of Huawei, the Chinese government took 2 Canadians, right? From that point on, Canada is no longer the same. You need to have these pivotal changes happen to the country. And as bad as it sounds, you need to have been smashed really badly, brutally beaten by the iron fist of communism or the iron fist of the CCP to be able to understand, wow, that's how they are. So Australia, another great example, the CCP launched a trade war against them because their prime minister questioned the origin of COVID. So you have to have been abused by the power in Beijing before you can realize how bad they are. So to answer your question, it's tough because not every country feels like, even if they know that there's infiltration, they don't feel like it's threatening to them yet. Obviously, until it's too late. Like even in the United States, right? In the state of New York, there's a lot of problems now. I recently saw this video of this traffic police guy in Flushing, which is where Chinatown is, telling these democracy movement demonstrators, telling them they're dumb or something like that. So it's like you have people working inside the New York government, the governments in the United States. So it's not like this problem away, but it takes a very long time and a lot of drastic problems before countries will realize what's going on.
All right, David, we've just got 2 more questions, and thank you so much for your time. We know you're a bit pressed for it. You were one of the first, if not the first, English language media outlets to break the story of Alice Guo and her Fujian links. This was even months before Al Jazeera came out, and I think even before local Filipino media outlets covered it. One of my producers is asking, how were you able to do that? What's the process of being able to trace her family, being aware of their Communist Party roots, being aware of how prominent they are in their Fujian area?
Right. So what's interesting is that, to the credit of the CCP, they publish all these stuff online too. So if you can read Chinese, you can actually find a lot of it, because the thing is, even if these events are nobody will pay attention, if some guy went to a dinner and met another person, but the CCP publishes all of them on their embassy websites. These associations will publish them on their own websites, because this is the result of the world was at the knees of the CCP for a few decades, because they were, they had so much money, they had so much products coming out, everybody relied on China, right? So they didn't care that this was out in the open. In fact, a lot of times, not this with Alice Guo, but with a lot of other stories, it wasn't until that people found out, these documents from a few years ago, that the publishers or the government will go back and delete them, because they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I published this out in the open. That's the great thing about open source intelligence, is you can always find something online now. even even if it takes you a while. But for me, basically, a viewer, again, I believe a Filipino viewer, sent me a few pictures of the newspaper, and then I just looked into the words. I was like, huh, so these are the different associations congratulating her. They must know who she is or who her dad is. And so I looked at each one of the associations. I basically searched, was there any event attended by a CCP official? And I did find one where her dad belonged to this association of the Guo family, and it was attended by the Filipino Chinese ambassador to the Philippines at the time, 2015 or something. And then also there was another spy wing official there too. So anytime you see that, you're like, okay, yeah, that immediately means they are doing something with them, because you don't invite the president of some, like, you don't go to an event and that has nothing to do with you, right? So that's how you go about that. Now, in terms of how I found out about her origin, like where she's from, I basically typed in, her family is called Chaodai, which is like the little township in that coastal city. So I found that and I looked at it, the Guo family, the history of it, going back to the Ming Dynasty, I believe. So just you put one and one together, you get two, and that's basically what happened.
And the documentary by Al Jazeera seems to have vindicated a lot of your open source intelligence work. So as we wrap up, I guess we can ask a very overarching question. Is that one of the things I've noticed about your work is you cover a lot of the structural, socioeconomic, and cultural issues that are really plaguing China, and that's similar to views like what was being covered by Chris Chappell at China Uncensored and by Gordon Chang, and they constantly report on these main macro and micro issues in plaguing Chinese society. So there's the sense in your mind that there seems to be this rot in Chinese politics and society that's like a ticking time bomb, similar to what we saw with the USSR system, that it can't sustain forever. And perhaps you can expand on this as we close, because this is certainly something that flies in the face of 30 years of neoliberal thought, that if we just have peace with China, we can trade with China, China will liberalize as the more McDonald's we put in. And it's only now that country seems to, and people seem to be coming around to your line of thinking. So briefly, why, I guess not briefly, as long as you need to, sir, why shouldn't countries hitch their economic and political wagons with China in your mind? And do you think Chinese hegemony is inevitable, like what many individuals are saying in the West, or is this something that we can isolate if needed?
Right, so I'll start by saying there's a Chinese saying called 30 years, the east of river, and 30 years the west of river. The idea is that shifts happen decades and you might not even notice it until it's already too late. So China had about 2-3 decades of growth, and it is now declining, and everybody can see that. Now, you could say that it's because of the policy of one man, Xi Jinping, that has averted the growth of China. But I see it as it's almost the inevitable evolution of a communist sort of, you can people always say, oh, China's not communist anymore, blah, blah, blah. I mean, like, they're still linked to the teachings of Karl Marx, so I see them still using the communist principles. Same thing with the USSR, right? The fundamental thing that I think really destroyed the country wasn't supposed to be the economic policy changes, because everything in China is political. So every decision made by the Chinese government is political. And because Xi Jinping, you could say that when he was in power, he believes that his vision of how to, because you got to remember, every CCP official in power, their goal is always to maintain and to preserve the power of the party. But they have different versions of this, right? Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao, after Deng Xiaoping, their vision of the country was you reform the economy, but you don't reform the politics, right? The ideological side of things, you make that still economy, you can open up. But Xi Jinping's version of it is to say that we brought too many changes through economic reform that it's going to inevitably lead to destruction of the party. So my version of this is we don't do any of that, right? So even though they're always trying to preserve the party, in turn, some of the policies actually end up undermining that attempt. So right now, China is Actually, I would say, part of it is valid because what the reform and opening up has done is it gave explosive wealth to the country overnight. And people, here's the thing about socialism and communism, they always say that everybody has to get equity, right? Equalness. But that's not really how human nature works. Human nature is very selfish. And when you give a population that was once dirt poor hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, you don't really get like philanthropists out of it. You get a lot of selfishness. You bring out the worst of people, and that's what happened with China. They really they took money and they ran with it, right? They overnight put up skyscrapers. You can imagine property developers want to make more money than they ever did, so they're going to cut corners. When people see that there's a lot of money to be made, they want to pocket them. You get corruption, and you get a combination of that. So when you saw the golden era of China, you're always going to see the downfall of it by the same coin, just the other side, because the things that they use to cut corner to grow fast are also the things that are not coming back to hunt them. So for example, I talk about the tofu drag situation in China. I talk about the fake products, the poisonous food in China. All those are products of their own doing because they want to preserve the country. Now, so that was reform and opening up, right? Now Xi Jinping is saying that, okay, yeah, those problems are problems I have to deal with. So I'm going to, decelerate. I'm going to go backwards. But when he does that, not only can he not stop what was already happening in those 30, 40 years, he's also put another layer of trouble on people because what he's done is destroy the consumer confidence of people in China. He's destroyed the real estate market, or you could say he's helped to expose what was already coming just faster. But either way, he essentially put another layer of trouble on top of that. So then you have the long-term, right? Because people always say, Gordon Chang wrote a book like 20 years ago saying the coming collapse of China. It never happened. Well, technically it is happening, but it's on a much slower timeline. When Xi Jinping came into power in 2012, he accelerated that timeline. So now I'm very confident to say that the coming collapse of China is real and it's happening very fast. And I'd say within the next 5 years, I think if not even earlier. And in fact, you mentioned the hegemony of China. So Xi Jinping, when he came into power 10 years ago, 12 years ago now, he was very confident that the hegemony was coming. The era of the Chinese dominance 2050 or 2049 or whatever the timeline was, is coming. But now I genuinely think it's much harder to do. You can still try it. You can use, the people as cannon fodders to do it. You can still try, but I really don't think, with all the problems that I see of China, I don't think the hegemony is coming anymore. And in fact, I see a dramatic decline, one that we have not seen in recent history to any country, because all of the problems are piling on. I think we can spend another hour talking about those problems, but you're gonna have to trust my words for it. But all the problems are piling on. There's no real solution. The only solution, I keep saying this, I'm like, the only solution for them is they just, abandon the party, just step out of power, and then things will finally come into place. But they won't do that. So there's really no solutions for them.
David, thank you so much for your time and insights, and we hope you continue your great work in exposing the deeds of the CCP and, of course, promoting national sovereignty. Because of your expose, Alice Guo has become a national conversation and even a household name. And do you think the Alice Guo hype train will be ending anytime soon, or as Ivan had said, we are just on the tip of the iceberg? Anything you would like to say to our listeners as we close this episode?
I'm happy to come back and do more. I love talking about China, and but keep following it. Maybe Alice Guo's story will end, but it doesn't mean that the entire situation will end. And I think there's much more work to do, for the government, for people in Philippines. Keep watching our contents, and because I think being informed about this is the best way to cure defend against the threat. So in terms of what's going to happen in the future, I think obviously nobody knows, but the Philippines is very important in what could potentially happen in Asia. I think the people should be proud of the government, at least on this thing, what they've done. There's obviously no government's perfect, and I'm not saying that Marcos Jr. is like the best president or whatnot, but I'm saying that let's give credit where credit is due, right? It's I think there's a lot of things like, with the U.S. too, I'm like, Trump did a lot of great things. Biden did a lot of great things. You don't have to pick a side, especially when you have a common threat, on things like China. So, but yeah, I'll leave my point there. Continue to watch and see where things go.
And this has been Sitrep PH, the podcast on Philippine affairs and Filipino interest. This is Informed PH hosting with Ivan at home. Be sure to follow our social media for updates on our upcoming podcasts and, of course, access to our old episodes. Ivan?
We are at Sitrep PH on X and on YouTube, and also like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Sitrep PH. Philippines, thank you and good night. Mabuhay.
Thank you, David.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, David.